Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our redistricting panel, an update on New York State redistricting. My name is Frederick Velez. I'm the National Director of Civic Engagement for Hispanic Federation, and I'm very excited, and I want to welcome all of you to this panel where we will be talking about what's going on with New York State redistricting, what's been happening, what are the effects on redistricting for the Latino community. And we're also going to be talking about what's next. We're going to be answering a couple of questions that you all might have because we want to know, is the process over? Is redistricting over? What can we do for future redistricting processes? And also what's next? Because from what I hear, and we've been talking, there's the local New York City redistricting process that will be happening soon. And not only in New York City, right? It's a municipal redistricting process. So it'll be happening all across the state. And with New York City being the largest city in the United States, that's bound to get interesting. So we're here to answer all of your questions. I'm really excited about the group of panelists that we have here. All of them have been working on redistricting in some way or form. And have also been working alongside the Latino community to ensure that we are informed, that we understand how this process will affect us. So first of all, I want to introduce Cesar Ruiz, who's the Equals Work Fellow for LatinoJustice PRLDEF. How are you, Cesar?
Great, thank you, Frederick. Nice to see everyone.
Great to have you with us. We also have with us Julio Rivera, the National Senior Manager for Campaigns at NALEO Educational Fund.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much, Frederick and Hispanic Federation for inviting us today.
No, of course. We also brought Lucia Gomez, the Political Director of the New York City Central Labor Council. How are you, Lucia?
Doing well. Thank you for having me.
And we also have with us Emily Paez, who's Hispanic Federation's Director of Government Affairs and Civic Engagement. Hi, Emily.
Muy buenas tardes. Very excited to have this conversation with everyone.
No, I'm super happy. And I think Julio said it best when we were talking about this a couple of days ago, that this is like a conversation that we're always having, and we're kind of bringing in along members of our community so that they can listen about how we talk about this and discuss. So we're going to try to keep it very, very conversational. If anyone has any questions during the conversation, please put them on the chat, and I'm going to make sure that our panelists can answer them. So what we're going to do is that we're going to start with a presentation by Cesar, who's going to walk through what happened in the New York redistricting process lately, where we're at. And after that, we're going to then bring on the panelists so they can answer some of our questions. So Cesar, take it away.
Great, thank you, Frederick. Share my screen quickly. Perfect. Going to present everyone can see it on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
So as Frederick had mentioned, I'm going to do a brief overview on what went down in the process, kind of walk through, the lawsuit a little bit, and then like some next steps and some analysis on the maps, and open up the conversation for the rest of the panelists. So first, I wanted to provide like a visual overview of the process. This redistricting cycle was unique, and that this is the first time we had the Independent Redistricting Commission. And so this is a culmination of a lot of efforts to really reshape the process and make sure that it works to the benefit of community members and really centered around their voice. But this was the first iteration of that process. And so we saw a lot of historic things. So I kind of want to walk through this bit of a timeline. As you can see on the left, it talks about the beginning of the redistricting all the way on through. So the first step was really the appointment of commissioners, and there was a lot of advocacy between Latino organizations to make sure that we were amply represented. That culminated in a Latino being represented on the commission. We were still not happy with representation, but we were happy to see that the commission was finally put together and we could start to see it go through action. And so from that, the Independent Redistricting Commission held hearings throughout the state in all different parts of the state. And really that was focused on gathering public input throughout the process. And there were really three phases of that. There was the initial phase that really looked at what are community concerns that have to go into the process. Second was them releasing their first sets of maps. And then the third was looking at their final release of maps. And in this, you can kind of see that middle point is that throughout this, there were really two sets of maps by democratically appointed individuals and Republican appointed commissioners as well. And so that was some of the tension in this new process. We wanted to remove partisanship from this, but it became, it was very clear that this was reinforcing partisan divides that exist. And that was, I think, a hard part to kind of deal with that. So once the IRC kind of finished its process, it has to submit it to the legislature. And so when it started to shift to the legislature, they had the option to either accept those maps or reject them. Again, they were given really two sets of maps, one from Republican appointed commissioners and one by democratically appointed commissioners. And so that tension kind of played out. What the legislature ultimately did was reject both sets of maps. The IRC got the opportunity again to redraw the maps, but then they were rejected again. And so this allowed the legislature to adopt their own set of maps, which they had in hand. And so that shift to the legislature, I think, brought up a lot of community concerns about the community's voice in this process. There were a lot of calls for a public hearing. The legislature didn't really engage with that and really instead opted to just release their own set of maps and forego that public comment. And so we can see some aspects of public comment reflected in it, but we don't see all. And so I'm sure the other panels will explore that, but I at least wanted to walk you through the process and give you an overview of what that was like. And so the next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the maps, and I wanted to give everyone a visual. On the left, you can see the congressional maps, and that's for the entire state. It's important to note that in New York, we lost one seat. So that means that we had to reconfigure the districts in a way that accounted for that loss. Another notable fact is that New York has been steadily declining. We've lost seats in the past, and we were incredibly close to maintaining 89 people. We missed it. So it shows how important the census is to this work and what a difference it can make in our representation on the congressional level. Of note, on the congressional side, I mean, when I think of Latino community concerns, I think a lot of folks in the community were disappointed with what was done to Nydia Velasquez's district. Park Slope was a community that was in her district for a long time, was a community that she's built up and that she's given a lot of support, and that represents a lot of the work that she's done. So sadly, through this process, that was something that was taken out of her district. And advocates, we kind of all lined up to talk about what were next steps. The unfortunate side on the congressional is that there's not many legal standards that allow you to kind of address those concerns. Partisan gerrymandering is allowed on the federal level, which kind of limits our advocacy. But we were still really stunned and a little bit disturbed by what we saw in the congressional maps, particularly with Nydia's district, given how much of an advocate she's been for our community and how much work she's done. So I think it's important to note that. And so the second set of maps are the state Senate maps. And again, you can see this in previous cycles, it had been increased to 63, that was maintained. What we see in the Senate districts in New York, and again, I'm gonna create space for the panelists to kind of share their insights, but some quick takeaways that I think will stand are that despite the Latino growth in New York City and downstate, particularly the 5 boroughs, there was most of the growth that fueled in the state. We didn't see much or any shifts. Latino communities in the Bronx grew a lot, but we didn't see really any of the boundaries shifted to reflect that. And I think that was a huge disappointment for us. We realized that Latino communities have shown growth consistently through the past decades, and we always are going to argue and stand behind the fact that that should be recognized. And a huge disappointment with a Democratic supermajority that there was a failure to really engage with that. And so, this project is not something we're incredibly thrilled about. And I'm gonna, leave it there because I want to give space for other folks to share as well. And the last set of maps are the assembly maps. And these are very small districts with a lot smaller populations. So I think they really had the opportunity to do a lot more but it's more or less the same. We didn't really see any expansion of districts to account for Latino growth, and that was a huge disappointment. There were a lot more opportunities on the smaller levels to really create that, and we just didn't see it. And so I like to give a visual to see it, but you can see how small these districts are. And breaking down, I think even the colors. So the green represents Latino voting age population. The orange represents Black voting age population. The blue represents white voting age population, and the pink purple represents Asian. So you can see that these clusters of communities are really compact, which makes it a lot, sometimes incredibly difficult to draw, as we experienced in the Unity project, but also on this level, like a lot more simpler, because you can create compact districts that recognize communities and their growth. And so on this level, much in line with the trends that we saw on the Congressional and the Senate, there just wasn't much recognition of the growth of our community. And that's a disappointment that we'll have to, deal with. And so that's just a brief overview of the maps. And I always like to give a visual. So now I'm going to transition into the lawsuit, talk a little bit about that and what's going on there. So a little scale, it's kind of, like lawsuits, and then a cover of the petition. So on this is, oh, sorry. Seems that I got so this lawsuit is incredibly interesting. Essentially, it was a challenge brought by Republican operatives in New York State that aimed to prevent the maps from being enacted. The core of their claims really revolve around the intent and spirit of the 2014 amendments and how the legislature undermined that spirit by producing partisan crafted maps, which diminish Republican constituents' ability to elect candidates of their choice. And so thinking about the nature of these claims, it is something that we as advocates wanted to raise and thought about raising given what we saw in the maps. But ultimately there are some real concerns with these claims, and really that has to do with, I think what we all recognize, partisanship. What role does it have in this process? Are we weighing protecting incumbents over protecting community members? I think we can all agree, no, we want a community-centered process. And so that brings up a lot of other questions. As I previously mentioned, on the federal level, there's not really much that can be done with partisanship. The Supreme Court has really washed their hands of that. And so that really leaves us with developing tools on the state level to protect that community interest. And it's important to note that the nature of their claims really rest on the 2014 amendments and all of the work done by communities to make sure that it's a community-centered process. But some of the issues that they run into are the fact that the language doesn't create an explicit burden on the legislature beyond considering what the IRC produces. And while the IRC has an explicit mandate not to consider protecting incumbents, that was not imposed on the legislature through the language. And so we're unsure of where this lawsuit goes. It's important to note that no state court has overruled a state legislative map in over 50 years. So bringing a challenge like this is incredibly difficult and very uncertain. And so, we're not sure where it goes. And we were hesitant to intervene given the political nature of this challenge. We're a nonpartisan organization. I think much like all the folks on this call, and our interest is really how is the community protected in this process and what challenges can we raise there. And so that's a brief overview of the lawsuit. If folks have more questions, I can dive deeper, but that's just the broad overview. And then I think the important thing is to kind of reflect on this process and think how we move forward. One of the silver linings is that there was an incredible amount of public participation and community engagement in this process. So I think it shows that the communities are willing to speak for themselves and speak up and speak out, which I think is incredibly important and something we can build upon. So I think in ways about looking ahead, we just want to rethink the role of the commission and whether we have to reform that process. I think a lot of folks would say that it didn't work. I remember calls with Lucia and her saying early on that she had no faith that it was going to work. And we kind of all saw that unfold. So I think it's something that we all have to think about, especially with the impact that it has on our community. I think the second piece is continuing to build on the networks that we have. While we had a robust show out, we want to continue to engage folks in this process build education efforts, and get those damn 89 people that we need for the census so that we can make sure that our representation is maintained, because we know, New York kind of leads the way on a lot of issues, and we want to make sure that our representation is maintained. And the last piece is just, fostering civic engagement and coalition building within the Latino community. And that goes in line with my second point. I just think it's important that we're engaging community members and folks to kind of build on the momentum that we have. And so that concludes my formal presentation, and I'll be around for questions. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Cesar. We really love this presentation. I think that you were able to not only, I think summarize some of these concepts in a way that I definitely wouldn't have been able to, but you touched on some of the points that we're definitely going to be talking about in the next moment. So you mentioned something, and that's why I wanted to start with Lucia, because I remember when I was first talking about the Independent Redistricting Commission, I was just saying, like, this will take partisanship out of the process. And I remember Lucia giving her opinion about that. And I was just like, you know what? I think you're touching on some great points here. So Lucia, was the IRC able to achieve taking partisanship out of this process? Did the IRC work?
No, right? Like, and even just the law doesn't allow for partisanship to be taken out of the process, right? So if we're going to have any illusions come 2030, once again, or any hope that partisanship will be removed from the process, I think a couple of things. Either they're going to change the composition of the Independent Redistricting Commission. Definitely shouldn't call it independent otherwise, but if not, change the composition, who appoints. And at the same time, if you're going to have 5 Dems and 5 Republicans, or that's not necessarily how it's broken up, but appointed by those individuals, then you probably need, some independent tiebreaker, right? Similar to what happens in New Jersey, whereas ironically enough, this cycle, the independent tiebreaker didn't just go with the Dems or the Republicans. It forced the Dems and the Republicans to kind of negotiate within themselves. Not many things great happened for all the Dems or all the Republicans, but just as a gist, either you change, that entity and the law essentially, or you ensure that partisanship is one of the criterias, right? Amongst all the other criterias, in a way that doesn't allow partisanship to be the main criteria, which we kind of saw within the final plans enacted by the legislature, and definitely incumbency as a protective kind of, backdrop. That pretty much what it was, right? You don't want those kinds of Dems in with these kinds of Dems, because it would yield a different outcome, even if they're all Dems, right? And we did see that. The other thing I would say, we got to start obviously before the appointment of the commission, right? So, absolutely, thinking already about folks within our communities that do this kind of work, that understand the data, that understands not, scrambling a couple of months before the appointments or after the appointments were made or only had 1 slot left to figure out who the best person was, and the outcome isn't always the best person, right? The other thing I would say is, we got to begin to actually use the data, use the tools as a community before the process begins. And these tools are readily available to us now to understand our work within human services organizations, within, just understanding census data would be critical, right? So that you have an understanding of how the community is actually laid out. We're going to be entering the process now with the city council redistricting. There's no time like the present to engage in the process and begin to see, similar to what we saw during the state process, where the growth is and where the population, might get a little tricky. I'm already hearing commentary from folks about what they think the data says that forces them to do stuff. But I would say the New York City Charter, different ways of interpreting it, does have a ranked component to the criteria. And I think Jeff Weiss put it in the chat, to us at least, that there is a ranked component in terms of the criteria utilized. That's something we should strongly consider for this independent commission.
Oh yeah, and you are also talking about some of the next steps that we're definitely going to need to figure out, because a lot of people think that 2030 is so far away, but I think for us in this space, we found out that 10 or even 8 years, right, is not a lot, especially when some of these processes and concepts and organizing we need to start doing with some time beforehand, because sometimes some of these things get done. And when we're reaching and we're trying to have these meetings, some of the maps are already drawn and they take us by surprise. So that's part of this conversation. I do want to talk to Julio a little bit, because Julio, you work closely with elected officials. And I kind of wanted to go through, the IRC, as Lucia mentioned, was designed to kind of propose a couple maps, but maybe it was designed in a way that the state legislature could at any point kind of use any argument to take over. So can you kind of like talk us through what was that thought process that the state legislature used to basically draw their own maps and not consider, or maybe not consider as much the ones that were drawn by the IRC?
Yeah, and I think it was written into the law, right? It was written into the law from the very beginning to give the legislature the power to basically claw this power back, right? And NALEO Educational Fund doesn't have a formal position on what is the best way of doing redistricting. Every state does it differently. Some states use independent commission, some states use the legislature itself, some states use the courts, right? The New York decided, and the voters of New York decided that an independent redistricting commission should be implemented. So we were very hopeful that the IRC would be able to come to some sort of agreement and present one unified set of maps. We believe, and I know many of the folks on this call believe that was the mandate of the commission, right? The commission failed to meet that mandate. And so it gave the perfect excuse for the legislature to be able to claw that power back, and basically draw the districts as they saw fit, and however it pleased them to draw those districts.
Yeah, and I remember, and everyone, you all can feel free to jump on at any point, right? I remember that when we were discussing this, some of the things that we were talking about is like, voters asked for this, right? So at least we need to let the process go on and see what's going to happen. And then we can start maybe talking about reforms and seeing what needs to be done. Remember talking to Emily about this, and we were, what you were saying, Julio, which is like, well, what are the different models for redistricting? But there are literally, like, for each state, there's a different model, because even the independent ones have different criteria about who gets appointed or who makes a decision or how people get appointed. So Emily, what are you think some of the ways that we can work with community members, we can work with the Independent Redistricting Commission to make it more independent, right? Or to at least do some reforms that we think might make it the process work better in the future?
Sure. So I think that's a great question. And I think that's one that right now, as leaders and community organizers and people in this space, we need to kind of join forces and think strategically I guess in multifold, but primarily kind of like, why did the Independent Redistricting Commission fail, right? What were some of the challenges that they came across, right? When we talk about gridlock voting, the fact that there is a 10-member commission where, it becomes challenging for you to pass a single set of maps if you have the ability to go on a 5-by-5 vote, which was forecasted. And essentially it is exactly what happened. And so that was definitely one of the biggest challenges. Another challenge that the IRC was faced with was making sure that they received the adequate amount of funding in order to operate, being able to hire the appropriate staff, also being able to help fund some of the tools and technologies and systems that are required to crunch the data, right? And to make sense of it and to propose these individual maps. And so there were challenges when it comes to gridlock voting. There were challenges when it came down to, executing this in an appropriate amount of time. I feel like things then became so compressed with time that they were rushed. And so, there were certainly many challenges to that front. And when we think about the next steps and how to, in some way, make the Independent Redistricting Commission, I do agree with Lucia in terms of the independent term, right, I think should be kind of either rephrased or formatted differently, because it doesn't necessarily become an independent process. And it almost seems more like the Independent Redistricting Commission is more an advisory council that will produce a set of maps, and then, you know, the state legislature ultimately then decides. And so I think that identifying what the challenges have been are going to be critically important as we look forward to 2030. And then also, you know, whatever changes need to be made and amended to the current state constitution law to make it so that it is in more of, you know, in favor of that. If we want to change the makeup of the Independent Redistricting Commission, then we certainly do need to look into how to amend the legislation. So working with our elected officials to see how we can go about those kind of, you know, challenges.
And I think, you know, people may be wondering, why are we harping or why are we talking so much about reform, right? The maps happen, we haven't seen its effects, but I think that we have. There are a couple of things that are very important that Cesar mentioned also in his presentation with the new maps and some of the concerns that as a community have been raised because of those maps. Right now, about 27% of New York City residents identify as Latino. But we don't necessarily see that in any other representation, right, at the city, state, or even congressional level. And not only that, when we kind of look at the maps, they don't necessarily reflect the composition of the city. So from one side, we have commissions that are not representative of the city demographics or of the state demographics making those decisions. And on the other side, we have maps that also don't represent the city. So Cesar, from your experience, do you know, we're always harping about how New York City is one of the most diverse places in the world, how it's so great, all the languages and all the cultures. So do these new maps reflect that? Are Latinos gonna be able to reach that level of representation that we should have at all levels with these maps?
No. The reality is that it was maintaining the status quo. To quote Lucia, the incumbency protection plan, it was really focused on maintaining maps that were seriously outdated from the 2010 cycle, that were also malapportioned. And the shifts that they did make were not meaningful for community members and didn't really empower them to elect candidates of their choice where we could increase. On the congressional level, I think we have decent representation. We're at or close to where we need to be in terms of reflecting our population, but in the state legislative bodies, that is seriously not the case. And these maps really don't reflect that growth. And that's a huge disappointment. Again, this had been a process that was run by Republicans historically, at least in the last cycle it was. And this was the chance for Democrats who have a supermajority in the House to kind of reconcile some of the issues that advocates have raised in the past, particularly LatinoJustice and our partners ALDEF and Center for Law and Social Justice. You know, we kind of harped on that in our unity mapping project, what the concerns that we had and the opportunities for growth, and it was not met by the IRC or the commission or the legislature, and that's a huge disappointment. It again shows that it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on, people's intent are aligned with benefiting themselves, and that's a huge disappointment to the community members who again showed up, they showed out, they showed support, and we're engaged in this process in a very meaningful way. And so to the point of reform, whether we need to, I don't even think it's a question at this point, it's just the how. And I think a lot of our energy as we shift into New York City is how are we protecting our community members, and how are we showing up for them and supporting them, but then also looking forward and thinking about tangible ways. And I think Jeff Weiss in the chat has raised some great points about how we can reform, but I think it's a larger conversation and we need to kind of uplift these concerns as a collective and show our solidarity about a process that works for the people.
Yeah, and I think if there's one thing I think that, or one of the only things I think can say that work great about 2020, and I'm going to choose my words carefully, is the proliferation and multitude of tools and resources for redistricting, right? Lucia and I were talking that the last redistricting process was literally made on maps, on physical maps that had different versions, and you had to draw actual lines, right? But now we have all these tools that not only allow our community members to learn and find out how you can do some of these districts and mapping, but that also help us analyze what's happening more quickly than before. And I want to talk to Lucia about this. Lucia, how have these resources changed the game on our side, right? Now that we suddenly have that information, that data that we can use, and how can we use it to start asking for these recommendations that some of the panelists here have spoken about?
I mean, to be honest with you, I was in heaven, right? Steve Romalewski's, CUNY data mapping service and his redistricting and you was like God sent, right? Throughout the country, if I got curious about one thing, I jumped. I mean, it was perfect to viewing the maps as they came out in terms of proposal. He placed on there the unity map so people can see, what communities of color we're thinking of when we were trying to pay attention to protecting the voting rights of communities versus protecting the incumbent that was, representing that community, right? Shifts every 10 years. We definitely didn't see that the IRC made those kinds of shifts, or saw or even followed demographic shifts. So, unfortunately, with the tools that we had, it seemed like they were still back in 2010 and 2000, kind of doing status quo map drawing. That was just really amateur hour, I think. I would also say that, we have so many free softwares for drawing maps that there's no pretext, right? Like one of the mindsets that we do have to get out of this, get out of the rut is assuming others are going to do for us in terms of institutions that have resources and staff and institutions. This is a process that only happens every 10 years. And we lose a lot of qualified individuals and a lot of people to different kinds of work in a 10-year cycle. Think about where everyone was 10 years ago. Right? You get a lot of people that are new within the mix and don't know where to begin. It's not one of these things, unless you're crazy like me and engage or other folks that, that participated in this in many years, there's a learning curve, and that learning curve cannot kick in when you need to be advocating. So the presumption that institutions are going to take the forefront as institutions that receive numerous dollars from these same individuals that you're trying to advocate against, it is a flawed theory, right? This will never happen. And so individuals in these communities need to begin to prepare now and armed with, at a minimum, understanding where they live and who represents them at the given moment. Like that's a basic community understanding. And that for me is critical to any kind of 2030 process and any kind of city council process. We need Juana, Jose, Maria, John, Jackson working with us and pushing advocacy organizations. No advocacy organization, no institution is going to say, no, we can't hear you. We're going to be able to say, listen, we're getting too much pressure from our communities, those that we represent, those that we are being held accountable as elected should, but they hide behind, these commissions. They hide behind their appointments and they said, no, you wanted, Latino representation, you got it. And that person did their job as if that's the only thing. So, definitely I hold myself accountable and everyone else in our neighborhoods who did not testify, who did not engage in the redistricting process. But at the same time, I understand, right? We're doing 30,000 other things. And this is a process that only comes once in a decade. So, I would say, let's just get on top of it, at a minimum, reaching out and saying, what, ¿qué granito de sal? What granito de arena can I throw on this so that I can be involved?
No, and I think that's a great point. And we also need to take responsibility. Like you mentioned, we just can't let others do for us, because then this is what happened. And as we all know, right, life comes at you fast, comes at you hard. You suddenly, you might have plans and suddenly they're done. So it's very important, I think, and very good that we're having this conversation, even if it means that we're having a conversation about 2020, preparing for 2030, right? And Julio, I know that NALEO, part of what they did all over 2020 with the census, asking people to get counted, right? Because we forget that was really the first step towards redistricting. Through all that process, you were providing resources and asking people like Lucia mentioned to please provide testimony, to get involved in the process. So now that the process is kind of over, and I'll put a pin on that because we're gonna go back to that, what are some of the options that people have? Is it, for example, can we start saying, hey, you know, the map is created, but I'm not gonna advocate and tell the state legislature how bad this map is, for example? What are some of the things that can be done to start proving our point and not wait until 2029 when it might be too late?
Right, the work has already started, right? And it's really not even over for the 2020 cycle, right? We still have New York City redistricting, for example, right? That's an active process that's just getting started, really. But the work can't start soon enough. And just like we're working on you know, planning for 2030 census. We know how important the census is to the redistricting cycle, how much of a loss missing just around 80 folks meant for the state of New York, right? It's all intertwined and it's all connected. So starting that planning process for having a robust census operation in 2030 is, I think, one of the first pieces. I think it's revisiting also the reforms and the IRC and the way that it's set up, right? Emily mentioned all of the issues that we faced when it came to making sure that the commission had funding. The funding was held hostage for months on end, and it took tireless advocacy by groups on this call, groups on this panel, by I'd call out the League of Women Voters that pushed really hard to make sure that the IRC had the funding to even be able to start doing its work, right? There was no funding to be able to hire staff, to start even creating a website, for example, and also the process and the functions of the IRC itself, right? Making sure that a Latino was appointed to the commission, right? Many of the from the initial round of appointments to that commission, none of them were Latinos. And again, it took advocates on this call, on this panel, to push to make sure that we had Latino representation on the IRC itself, right? So I think it runs the gamut. I think it takes early intervention, early involvement. I think for groups on this call, it's starting the planning process for how to put together workshops, educational workshops for how to put together a community of interest testimony, right, to deliver to these commissions, right? We saw countless people testify in front of the IRC, right, to give their input on what their communities and their districts should look like. Unfortunately, I don't think the legislature took that into too much account. But we're hopeful that here in New York City, we'll be able to build a robust campaign to make sure that folks are making their voice heard and they're reflected in the maps that come out.
Yeah, and you know, who would have thought that in 2022 and all the way until 2023, 2020 wouldn't be over, right? And in this case, I'm talking about redistricting, because right now we're all going to embark in the process to, and I was reading this over and over again just to make sure that the talking point is correct, the most populous city in the United States. That's what we're about to start dividing. And like I had mentioned previously, with 27% of the population identifying in the city as Latinos, it's very important that we can talk about representation. Unfortunately, we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks the appointments by both the mayor and the city legislature for the New York City Independent, I'm sorry, for the New York City Redistricting Commission. Sorry, the New York City Redistricting Commission, not independent. As we've talked about in this space, and also the state legislature, that's definitely a misnomer. So the question here is, and Emily, I want to pass it along to you. How are we feeling about Latino representation in this commission, and what are some of the things that we can do? Because if we feel that we're not being represented correctly, aren't we then repeating the same mistake or letting the same mistake that happened in the state legislature, where we didn't have the proportional amount, I would say, of Latinos to represent us in the commission and help us make these decisions?
You know, I think that's a very important question. And to kind of start things off, and I'll take a step back quickly, is the importance of having civic engagement conversations in other Latino conversations as well. And I don't think that we are speaking about civic engagement and the redistricting process as fluently and as often as we probably should. When we look at the New York City redistricting process and we look at the last cycles, I think just recently we were shared by one of our colleagues a report that Citizens Union put out, and it kind of went over the last perhaps 3 redistricting cycles. In those last redistricting cycles, the commission maybe had 1 in 3 redistricting cycles. So in the last 30 years or so, roughly, or maybe by last name, I should say, not that I would know that they identify or may have a specific background, but that in itself is concerning. The fact that we need to be more heavily involved and included in this conversation. Obviously, we've seen that that is an issue and a concern. And what I can say is that, I think Julio and folks have already mentioned is like, we need to continue to amplify this message and to have this conversation in different spaces and really lean on to the kind of resources that we all bring to the table and kind of best utilize it. Not everyone is a statistician. Not everyone is going to be able to look at a data, these huge amounts of data and crunch them into a way that's tangible and understandable for our communities. This is not a very trending conversation. I don't think it's trending on Twitter right now to talk about redistricting. It's trending in the conversation in the spaces where people are fluently talking about this. So we certainly need to tie in civic engagement with the success of health, with the success of education, with the success of everyday quality of life issues that affect us, because that is exactly and essentially what it impacts, right? Our day-to-day life when we think about the representation. And so how to kind of best go around organizing is really educating and promoting this sense of education and working collectively together. I commend the organizations that we are among right now for even formalizing the New York Civic Engagement Coalition, because we saw in the Independent Redistricting Commission in the state side, there was no Latino representation until we had to, as Lucia put it, scramble towards the end so we can appoint through this very narrow margin of having an independent member that could not be registered under a Democratic line or a Republican line. It was a very kind of narrow way for us to even have a seat at the table. And so that is, very concerning. So I think that we need to make the conversation of civic engagement more fluent. And we need to ensure that the individuals that are that we have put into office that are also making sure that utilizing numerical data. This is not, oh, well, Latinos need to have, we're kind of just like, being upset about something. This is because the makeup of New York City, one of the most diverse cities, is very heavily Latino, right? This is numerical information. This is living bodies within the 5 boroughs of New York City that represent our community. And this is why we should definitely have a seat at the table. So it's educating, organizing, and executing and putting a plan in place.
Emily, you definitely made a great point that we need to be more fluent and I think provide data points that kind of like stick with us, right, when it comes to redistricting. So here's 1 or 2 that I will say. As you mentioned, in the last 30 years, apparently we only had 1 Latino or 1 person that identifies as Latino in any of these redistricting commissions. In the New York City one, from what we've seen, and please correct me if I'm wrong, only 2 people that identify as Latino were appointed out of 15, which just is 13%. 13% of that commission, when again, we're 27% of the population. And the other thing, and this is something that I have to admit and profess that I'm a little disappointed at, is that when we were talking about ranked choice voting and the effects that it will have, the number 1 talking point that came out is that would lead to the most diverse New York City Council ever. And that happened. However, that somehow didn't translate into the most diverse, or maybe it is the most diverse redistricting committee right now, but it doesn't necessarily represent the diversity of the New York City population. And at least I know that I'm disappointed. And from what I can see from the other panelists, I think we're all there. So I do want to open it up to questions from the public. But before we do that, I do want to give an opportunity to everyone here to talk a little bit about, if you could say 1 or 2 things that need to be on top of our mind for next steps, both for the New York City redistricting process and also the state process that's technically still ongoing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think I personally want to just address real quickly that redistricting is the kickoff, right? The kickoff to making sure that districts are fair, take into account racially polarized voting, take into account historical disenfranchisement by both sides of the aisle, by all parties, and not doing proper outreach, not investing the right resources into our neighborhoods and into our communities to get out the vote, right? Not that the burden is necessarily on communities that are already disenfranchised, whether it's low-paying jobs, whether it's screwed up, transportation or screwed up housing situations, for them to remedy or then to be given two horrible choices or just a set of bad choices by their political parties. That's not, we're not trying to remedy all that or basically put the fault at not getting out to vote on our communities, right? We need to really ensure that redistricting at an onset is about not disenfranchising us for 10 years, understanding all those dynamics, understanding that there are already historical issues that ensure that our communities don't turn out, that have a history of not being able to show up to the polls, not exercising their due rights. But understanding all that, we create an even playing field from the get, and then we get to work, right? And that was the basis of, why we thought or we hoped that we would engage in a more fair process, not the same politics of many years ago.
Yeah,
Anyone?
I think for me, it's the themes that I think everyone here has been pushing. It's really building a robust civic engagement and community education effort. And also, I think to Lucia's point, which I think she raised, and it was great, the onus is on us. We're community leaders. We're individuals that do this work, and we should have a seat at the table collectively. So that means that we have to engage with the resources that we have, with the things that we can do and strategize. And we didn't see that this cycle. And we understand that the census numbers came out and there were delays and all of these things. But we were actively engaged in trying to engage the community members. And we will be for this next cycle. So I think for us, we can be sad or mad or upset about what the maps did, but the reality is we still have a chance with the New York City Redistricting Commission. And this serves as a lesson that Lucia raised again, is that the onus is on us to organize our community members, to educate them, to inform. This is not a process that has historically been open to community members. I can tell you I'm 6 months in and my head was spinning for the first few months doing this work because it is very technical. It is something that is very inaccessible. And so the onus is on us to really produce materials that make it accessible for community members and do the work. And so that's not going to be done by anyone else. We have to take accountability. What we see reflected on these maps is our best effort with what resources we have, but now we can take it as a next step forward to really create the change that we want to see in these institutions. And so it's very important that we recognize that the hyper-specialization of this work is something we can't escape, but having a more fluid conversation with community members, it flows through us. And that's elected officials, that is community-based organizations, and that's advocacy organizations. That's everyone that has to be at the table. And we have that opportunity for the New York City Redistricting Commission. So for me, it's more of a call to action. We have this opportunity, we have this space now, and we all have to act and not expect others to really do the work for us, because it's just not gonna happen.
Yep, I just want to kind of echo that sentiment, Cesar. You hit it nail on the head in terms of like just making sure that we are out there, again, pulling our best resources, making sure that everyone who is kind of, putting this information out there, we're utilizing kind of their best practices or their best familiarity. We're being able to crunch down some of this information and make it understandable for our community to even engage with it. As you said, it could become very heavy. And so I think in terms of the next steps, we have like Cesar mentioned, a way to still be involved in the city redistricting process and for our voices to be heard in terms of the districts that are going to represent us. When we're thinking about the city redistricting process, let's just put these into perspective. We're talking about the city council districts. We're talking about school districts. We're talking about the community board districts, the police precinct council districts. These are things that, all politics, as they say, our government is local, but this is very hyper local and will immediately in some way or shape affect us. And as a person, as a mom and living in a specific neighborhood, I know that it may change my school district, right, for my children. And so all of these things, again, affect our day-to-day lives. But certainly right now we have the ability to impact things on a city side. You know, it is a 15-member makeup, so hopefully we don't run into any gridlock voting on this front, but, you know, making sure that we organize ourselves. And, you know, this is actually going to be another part of our conversation that I'm sure Frederick will allude to, is preparing us, having this same kind of narrative and dialogue and conversation. I know that LatinoJustice does the unity mapping, and they really go forth and kind of go into the best practices of even putting together a testimony and testifying during one of these open public hearing events. And what does that look like? And what should I be presenting on? What are the top issues? What should I be looking forth? And, you know, how that impacts us. So utilizing all of those resources in that space and just getting out there in that way.
Totally echo all of my colleagues and agree with everything they just said. Like Cesar said, this is a very wonky technical process. Cesar and his colleagues at LatinoJustice have many times walked me through a lot of the details, so I know I have my facts straight. So like he said, we're responsible for organizing, educating our community, making this a relatable, easy to understand process, getting them involved. And I'll add one more thing. It's also holding the process accountable and holding the decision makers accountable, right? One thing we need to push for is to make sure that this process in New York City is accessible, that it's transparent, that we don't have the issue that we had with the state redistricting commission, for example, where even the sign-up process, all of the information was only available in English, right? New York City is an incredibly diverse city, and so that translates to us needing to be able to support many other languages besides English. So that's just one piece I think that we need to make sure that that the decision makers take into account.
And talking about those resources, I just put in the chat the link for a product or a concept that Hispanic Federation developed with some of our partners, which is the Redistricting Academy. In there, actually, you're going to be able to find the first ever conversation that we had with the organizations that are here present, which was a Redistricting 101 presentation, where you can learn a little bit more of the basics of the process before it had actually happened completely. And then this video will also be uploaded there as well to our YouTube page. So anyone that you would like for them to see this presentation or this panel or the one before, you can send them the link and they can be a part of this conversation. So we have about 10 minutes, I would say, for questions. So if anyone has a question, please put it on their chat or use the Q&A function. And I'm gonna make sure that our esteemed panelists can answer some of those questions for y'all.
And just to instigate a little, I placed a spreadsheet in the chat so that everyone can see how many Latino members. There's 3 Latino members, we're supposed to have 4. There's 5 white members, they're technically supposed to have 4.6, but there's no 0.6 person. So, and they don't have to be representational, it's proportional. It's people of color that are supposed to be proportional onto the commission, and they failed to do that. There's 1 overrepresentation of Asian communities, right? So they have 3. African Americans were supposed to have 3, they have 3. And Latinos who were supposed to have 4 have 3. So this is not like, rockets. These are numbers. This is the city charter. I understand it gets technical, but I decided to just follow these folks now. Now you'll have handles. As soon as I find emails, I'll find emails, right? They're supposed to be beholden to the city of New York, not necessarily to those that appointed them. So I'm going to be cynical and say they're beholden to those who appointed them and the relationship they build on that commission to then see eye to eye. And we shouldn't assume that there'll be a fair process unless there's enough people voicing their concerns and going out there and talking about their communities in a succinct way. So, let's be realistic. There's nothing apolitical about any of these processes. It's about electing individuals for the next 10 years. And if you're not with that, then you should probably engage in community boards or something.
And I just got the first question, which is, what is the expected timeline for the New York City process, the hearings, and all of that good stuff?
They haven't hired staff yet. They haven't, by the end of the year, we're supposed to have plans. If everything goes as planned, then you're thinking after budget, right? So no one's going to work on crap. Maybe they work at the same time. Maybe May, they'll kick off with their tour, right? You'll get a round of hearings by borough, maybe another round of hearings when they put out maps. So you should anticipate a set of hearings every other month between now and November, and then the passage of this sometime September. December. They'll put out a timeline, but they haven't.
And I'm sure that
started
as
to.
soon as they do, we'll all be publicizing it and making sure and promoting that people can go and do these hearings. Again, it's very important. I remember this didn't happen in New York, but I remember of someone saying that after the redistricting process, their front door neighbor was in another district. So they had to solve an issue that revolved around, I think it was like a pothole or a stop sign that they wanted to put. And in that particular city, it's legislatures who can do that. So they had to go talk to 2 different legislators because the new maps had divided their community down in half, a neighborhood. So that is why these things are important, that we need to be able to have these conversations.
On that point, I actually have a resource that I'm going to share that we can put on the Redistricting Academy website that kind of outlines that process. So where we are now, and this is based off of the city charter and past cycles, where we are now is they just finished appointments. So we can expect June is the next milestone for us to be mindful of. And what happens there is that both of the city council and the mayor have reconciled theirs, and then we start to move into the first phase, which is public testimony. And so we'll want to be ready for that. That's also primaries, and to Lucia's point, this is not the only thing we do. So we want to be mindful of like garnering support and building momentum into these things, because again, we're all civic engagement. And I think that's some of the tension that we realize now. We weren't just doing redistricting, we were doing all of the other things. So I say be on the lookout for events that we'll try and host or resources that we produce that can make this more accessible. And we offer ourselves as resources as well. If there's any way that we could be of service, I personally do presentations on redistricting. I can help walk through, and we offer ourselves. We don't just point at the problem, we offer solutions. And we're going to be producing resources that help kind of demystify some of these processes, because we understand how important it is. And we've also learned from the past, the state and even before, kind of like the issues that arise. And it doesn't end at representation. It really is a robust public showing and community engagement that will get us to where we need to be.
Well, look, I couldn't be more excited about this conversation. I really love talking to all of you. So I am going to probably invite you. We're going to have a couple of these to talk about the New York City process as well. And I know that we're going to bring y'all in to also talk about maps, about hearings, about how we can get involved. So I can tell every single participant right now that y'all can expect an invitation from us in the next couple of months so that we can talk about it. And again, we keep talking about the New York City redistricting process, but this is really a municipal redistricting process, right? So there's also a lot of counties and a lot of other cities in New York that will be going through this process. And as you all know, even though the bulk of the Latino population is in New York City, we have Latinos all across the state. So this will be an interesting conversation to have. I really do look forward to that. And I want to thank everyone here. I want to thank Emily, Cesar, Julio, and Lucia. This conversation, again, I knew that this was going to be great. A lot of people are saying that it was a great conversation. So hopefully we'll be able to invite them in the future. So thank to all of you and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day.